Welcome back, everybody, for our third deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking into online retail fraud.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty interesting. We're going to be talking about return fraud specifically. And this has become a real problem for businesses, both large and small.
It really has. And I think a lot of people don't understand the full impact of it. It's not just a dent in profits.
Right.
We're talking billions of dollars lost.
Yeah, billions.
Wasted resources, damage to consumer trust. It's a huge problem.
That is a crazy number.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars. So for our listeners out there who maybe aren't super familiar with the ins and outs of this, what exactly is return fraud?
So return fraud is basically any scheme that takes advantage of a retailer's return policy to essentially gain something unfairly. And that something could be money, a replacement product. Sometimes it's just the thrill of getting away with it.
Oh, wow. So there's like a bunch of different ways that this can happen. And we were looking at the research, and it looks like there are 8 different types of return fraud that are outlined.
Yeah, you're right. There are, and some are definitely more obvious than others.
Like what?
Well, one example is bricking.
Bricking?
Have you heard of that?
I have not.
So bricking is where someone buys an electronic device, say like a smartphone.
Okay.
And they'll gut it.
What?
Yeah, they'll replace all the valuable components with like junk, basically just weights or something.
Oh, wow.
And then they return the basically useless device for a full refund.
So they're literally returning a brick.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's surprisingly common.
Oh my gosh, that is brazen. Okay, so that's a pretty obvious one.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some of them are not quite so in your face. What would be an example of a less obvious one?
Well, think about wardrobing.
Wardrobing.
Yeah, maybe you've even been tempted to do this yourself.
I don't know.
Come on, you buy an outfit, wear it once for a special occasion like a wedding or something.
Okay, yeah, maybe.
And then return it.
I plead the fifth.
Right. It might seem harmless enough on an individual level, but when you multiply that by thousands or even millions of shoppers, it really adds up to a huge loss for retailers.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then there's also refund fraud. I was reading about that, and I'll admit I'm a little bit fuzzy on the details. So what is refund fraud, and how is it different from return fraud?
That's a good question. With refund fraud, you're not actually returning a physical product at all.
Oh.
Instead, you're trying to manipulate the system to get your money back without ever sending the item back.
Oh.
Or you might even claim you never received it in the first place.
So it's like lying, basically.
Exactly. It's all about gaming the system to get a refund that you're not entitled to.
Got it. And I imagine that it must be really hard for businesses to know the difference between someone who's being legitimate and someone who's trying to pull one over on them, especially with something like wardrobing, where there might not be any obvious signs of wear and tear.
It's a real challenge for retailers.
Yeah. Proving
intent is really difficult, but the reality is that even these seemingly minor instances of return fraud can have a huge cumulative effect. We were looking at some data from the National Retail Federation, and they estimate that return fraud costs U.S. retailers about $18.4 billion annually.
Wow, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
$18.4 billion. And that's just the direct financial hit, right? What about all the other costs that businesses incur because of this?
Oh, you're right. There's so many hidden costs as well.
Like what?
Well, think about all the time and resources that are poured into processing these fraudulent returns, restocking inventory, dealing with customer service inquiries.
Right.
Even the cost of disposing of damaged or unsellable goods. It's a logistical nightmare for businesses.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's also this sort of intangible cost, right? Like the damage to the relationship between businesses and consumers, because companies are getting burned all the time by fraudulent returns. They're going to have to tighten up their return policies.
Exactly.
And that's going to make it harder for honest shoppers to return things when they need to, so everyone loses.
You're absolutely right. It creates this kind of ripple effect that disrupts the whole retail ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a big mess. So, given how complicated this problem is, what are some of the things that companies are doing to fight back against return fraud? I mean, it can't be easy.
It's really challenging, but there are a few things that retailers are doing to try and stay ahead of the fraudsters. Some are implementing pretty simple measures, like requiring ID for returns, eliminating cash refunds, things like that.
Makes sense. Less wiggle room for shady transactions.
Exactly. But I think the real game changer is the use of technology.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically something called digital footprint analysis.
Digital footprint analysis. So what is that?
So this involves collecting and analyzing data about a customer's online behavior
Okay.
to kind of assess their risk level.
So it's kind of like a background check for online shoppers.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We're talking about things like their IP address, their device information,
Uh-huh.
browsing history, even their social media presence and purchase history across different platforms.
Wow, they're really looking at everything.
They are, and by looking for patterns and anomalies in this, data retailers can identify potential red flags that might signal a higher risk of fraudulent activity.
So, for example, someone's creating multiple accounts with like burner email addresses, or if they're constantly returning things without giving a good reason, that would be a red flag.
Exactly. It's all about connecting the dots and building a comprehensive profile of the shopper.
And this is where a company like Recor comes in, right? Because I know they're doing some really interesting work in this area.
They are. They're really at the forefront of this movement, developing solutions that not only help identify potential fraudsters, but also encourage responsible buying behavior, which is super important.
Absolutely. And they're really focused on helping Amazon sellers in particular, right? So why is that? Why are Amazon sellers especially vulnerable to return fraud?
Well, Amazon's marketplace is huge.
Yeah, it's massive.
It's massive, which makes it a prime target for fraudsters.
Right.
And their return system is really lenient. In a lot of cases, items aren't even inspected before a refund is issued, so it creates this big loophole for abuse.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster. I can totally see why Amazon sellers are in desperate need of some solutions. So how is Recor addressing this particular challenge?
They're doing some really innovative things.
Ooh.
One of their key strategies is actually grading buyers.
Rating buyers like in school.
Kind of think of it like a credit score, but for online shoppers.
Oh, interesting. So if you have a history of making a lot of returns, your score goes down.
Exactly. And on the flip side, if you're a responsible shopper who only returns items when there's a legitimate issue, your score goes up.
I can see how that would make people think twice before just hitting that return button for no reason. So what are the implications of this score? Like, how does it actually affect shoppers?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. So a buyer's score can actually impact a variety of things. You know, they might find themselves paying higher shipping fees.
Oh, really?
Or they might miss out on certain discounts or promotions, or even experience delays in getting their refunds processed.
So it's kind of a system of rewards and consequences for shoppers.
Exactly. It's all about encouraging responsible behavior.
I see. That makes sense. But I'm curious, isn't there a risk of like unfairly penalizing people?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what if someone has a legitimate reason for making a lot of returns?
Yeah.
Like maybe they keep getting sent damaged goods or something.
That's a valid point, and Recora's system definitely takes that into account. It's not just about punishing people.
Okay.
It's about creating a system that rewards those who are playing by the rules.
Right.
And encourages everyone to shop more responsibly.
I like that it seems like a more holistic approach.
Yeah. And it aligns with Recora's overall mission, which is to bring more transparency and accountability to the world of e-commerce.
Speaking of accountability, I was reading about Recora's concept of e-commerce buyer points.
Yeah.
What exactly is that, and how does it fit into all of this?
So basically, they're taking that buyer score concept and turning it into a positive reinforcement system.
Okay.
Think of it like a loyalty program. But instead of just rewarding you for spending money, it rewards you for being a conscientious shopper.
Oh, so you earn points for things like making purchases, leaving thoughtful reviews.
Yes, exactly right.
Referring friends.
Yep.
And of course, having a good return history.
All of those things. And then those points can be redeemed for perks like discounts, free shipping, early access to sales, even exclusive products or experiences.
Oh, wow. That's cool. So it's kind of like gamifying responsible shopping.
Exactly. And it really works because it taps into our natural desire for, you know, recognition and reward.
Right.
And it helps to create a more positive and engaging shopping experience for everyone.
Yeah, I can definitely see the appeal of that. You know, thinking about all of this, it really highlights how much power we have as consumers. Our choices have a real impact, not just on individual businesses, but on the entire online retail landscape.
Absolutely. Every click, every purchase, every return, it all sends a signal to the market.
And those signals shape the way businesses operate and evolve. So in a sense, we're all kind of co-creating the future of online shopping.
I love that.
It's an interesting thought, but let's be real. Most people probably aren't thinking about the bigger picture when they're browsing Amazon at like 2:0 a.m.
You're probably right.
They just want to find what they need, get it delivered quickly, and be able to return it hassle-free if it doesn't work out.
True convenience is a huge factor in online shopping, but that emphasis on convenience can sometimes come at a cost.
What do you mean?
Well, for one thing, there's the environmental impact to consider, all the packaging, the transportation, the warehousing.
Right. I hadn't really thought about that.
And then there's the waste that's generated when items are damaged in transit, become unsellable, end up in landfills. It's a lot.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Right.
It seems like we need to find a way to balance the convenience of online shopping with a greater sense of responsibility.
Absolutely. And I think companies like Recora are really leading the way in that regard. Their focus on transparency, accountability, positive reinforcement, it's all about shifting the culture of online shopping in a more sustainable direction.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the future of online shopping? Do you think these trends towards greater accountability and transparency are going to continue?
I think they have to. The current system is simply not sustainable.
Why not?
For one thing, consumers are demanding more ethical and sustainable practices from businesses.
Right.
And for another, businesses are realizing that return fraud is eating into their profits and damaging their reputations. It's kind of a perfect storm that's driving innovation in this space and forcing everyone to rethink the way we do business online.
So it's not just about technology. It's about changing the culture of online shopping.
Exactly. We need to move away from this idea that buyers can return anything for any reason, no questions asked.
Sure.
We need to start valuing responsible behavior.
And that's where education comes in, both for retailers and for consumers.
Absolutely. Retailers need to be upfront about their return policies, the costs associated with returns.
Right.
And consumers need to understand that returning an item isn't just a harmless inconvenience. It has real costs associated with it.
Yeah, because ultimately those costs get passed on to all of us in the form of higher prices.
Exactly. So it's in everyone's best interest to create a more responsible and sustainable return culture.
I completely agree. It sounds like we're at a turning point in how we approach online shopping.
I think so too. And it's going to require a collective effort from everyone involved, businesses, consumers, technology providers like Recora.
Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the role of digital footprint analysis in combating fraud. Can you talk a bit more about how that technology works and what some of the ethical considerations are?
Sure. So as we touched on before, digital footprint analysis involves gathering and analyzing data about a customer's online behavior.
Okay.
Things like their IP address, device information, browsing history, purchase history, even their social media activity.
So you're basically piecing together this digital jigsaw puzzle to create a profile of the shopper.
Exactly. And by looking for patterns and anomalies in this data, businesses can identify potential red flags that might indicate a higher risk of fraudulent activity.
Like, what would be an example of a red flag?
So let's say someone is creating multiple accounts using disposable email addresses, or if they're consistently returning a high percentage of their purchases without giving clear reasons, those would be considered red flags.
That makes sense. But I imagine this kind of data collection raises some privacy concerns. How do we balance the need to protect businesses from fraud with the need to protect consumer privacy?
That's a crucial question, and it's one that companies like Recora take very seriously. They are committed to using data responsibly and ethically.
Okay, good to know.
And they adhere to strict data protection regulations so consumers can feel confident that the information is being handled securely.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation, but before we go, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
I love it. Let's hear it.
Imagine a world where your online shopping reputation matters as much as your credit score. How would that change your behavior as a consumer?
Ooh, that's a really good question. It really makes you think about, the weight of your online actions and how they could potentially affect your digital reputation in the future.
Yeah, it's like, what if there was this whole system for tracking how responsible you are as an online shopper, and that information was available to businesses?
Right. It raises all sorts of questions about data privacy and transparency and accountability.
Yeah, for sure. So we need to make sure that these systems are being used responsibly and ethically, with consumer rights and data security at the forefront.
Absolutely. Well, I think this has been a really great conversation.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's been fascinating to really dive deep into the world of return fraud and learn about all the different ways it impacts businesses and consumers.
Yeah, and I hope our listeners now have a better understanding of how complex this issue really is.
Definitely. And I especially hope that they'll come away from this with a greater appreciation for the importance of creating a more sustainable and ethical online shopping environment.
That would be fantastic.
So to wrap things up, I just want to encourage everyone to check out Recora's website at www.recora.recora.com to learn more about the amazing work they're doing in this space. They're really on the cutting edge of developing solutions to prevent fraud and promote responsible online shopping.
They are a great resource for both businesses and consumers.
Well, thanks again for joining us on this deep dive into the wild world of return fraud. Until next time, happy shopping, everyone.